CBS News legal contributor and Loyola Law School professor Jessica Levinson joins me now. Jessica, let's now sit right down on top of the law here. We've been talking about politics and the reaction in the street. What successful case did the prosecution make here, just to remind people of what they were able to do, and your reaction to the case now that there's been a verdict?
Well, my reaction is that the prosecution was able to tell a consistent story of what makes the most sense here. What makes the most sense is that Donald Trump entered into basically a criminal conspiracy to try and bury this story, and that's Stormy Daniels' allegations in the wake of the Access Hollywood tape, so that the voters didn't hear about what she has to say. And you, the jury, heard what she had to say. How do you think that would have landed with the voters right before they walked into the ballot box? So I think the prosecution was able to take a complicated case. John, you and I talked about it. There were a lot of hurdles that the prosecution had to cross, and they were able to say, what makes the most sense? And I think what's important is they really did use, forgive the expression, but a belt and suspenders approach, where they knew that they didn't have perfect witnesses. They knew that they didn't always have perfect evidence, but every moment they tried to say, we're backing it up. You don't just have to believe Michael Cohen. Look at what everybody else is telling you as well. You know, I have to say, when we got word that the verdict was coming back today at this moment, I think it was clear what the verdict was. But let's remember, there are still live issues on appeal.
Well, that's a crucial point to make. While we're talking here about respecting the judicial process, there is the jury part of the process, and then there is the appeals part of the process. So before we get to punishment, clearly they're already thinking about appeals in the Trump camp. What would be a reasonable ground, or what do you think the appeals process will look like from them?
So I think it will be everything from start to finish, in the sense that there are some questions about whether or not some of the jurors potentially should have been kicked for cause, meaning that they just shouldn't have been there because they couldn't render a fair verdict. There will be questions about the way this case was charged. This is a state case dealing with a federal candidate, and it was a fairly novel application of a New York election law, which said the falsification of business records, that alone is a misdemeanor. How do you kick it up to a felony? You have intent to commit or conceal another crime. That other crime, as I just mentioned, was basically unlawful election interference in New York. And then they had to add meaning to that word unlawful. The judge gave them three options: campaign finance violations, federal campaign finance violations, state and federal tax violations, and other business records violations. That is unique. Watch for the Trump team to say the way this was charged is not proper. It violated due process, and the statutes did not allow for a conviction under this circumstance. I think lastly, look for them to challenge not just the judge in this case, but to challenge Stormy Daniels' testimony, where they asked for a mistrial. Right after the testimony, they said it was irrelevant, it went too far. So lots of live grounds for them to appeal here.
Right, irrelevant, went too far into the details of the alleged encounter. Let's go now back to the punishment. Sentencing is scheduled for the 11th of July. What can we expect to happen there? And give us your sense of whether, everybody wants to know about whether jail time is even in the possibility here.
It's a possibility, but I do not think it's a probability. Let's look at what's going on. First-time offender, non-violent felonies. If we are to say that this is a case where we're treating the former president like any other defendant, I think, John, if you and I were having this conversation about Donald Smith, I would say, looking at all the allegations here, we're looking at probation. Now, that's not nothing, but it's certainly not time in prison. And I know that separate from that, a lot of people are saying he's a convicted felon. Can he vote? And my best reading of the law is, as a voter in New York, you look to the law where he's convicted. New York says you can vote unless he's incarcerated. So no incarceration means he can vote.
Unless he has to vote in Florida, which has, I think, a different set of laws, right? It's determined by the state that he would be in. So because I think he's going to be voting in Florida.
So I believe that, I apologize. I believe Florida says, look to the law of the state where you were convicted.
Oh, okay. Okay. It's very helpful. Now, let me ask you about the Supreme Court, where, I mean, could they have a role in this ladder of appeals? Or Well, just take it from there.
Yes, but this is a state case. And so they have to find, for the Supreme Court to take it up, they have to find a live federal question. And so there could be, I think the defense will try and say, well, there are due process considerations here with, again, how the case proceeded, how it was charged. But I do want to emphasize that the vast majority of times, the state Supreme Court is the last word on a state criminal conviction. Again, I think that doesn't mean the Trump team won't try and bring this to the Supreme Court. But John, as you know, the Supreme Court is plenty busy with some other Trump cases as well, dealing with his immunity from criminal prosecution for official acts and dealing with whether or not that obstruction statute that he is charged under in the DC election interference case is a good fit for January 6th.
Let me ask you a question, Jessica, about the judge's instructions. One of the things that the jury asked for was a portion of that to be reread for them. Did you see anything out of the ordinary in the judge's instructions? Because that's one of the things, there were many things mentioned, some of them not germane by the former president, but the role of the judge in this, did you see anything in his jury instructions? Because some other Republicans, Senator Marco Rubio, have mentioned something about the jury instructions. Did you see anything in that was either grounds for appeal or that was not according to the normal patterns that judges use in these cases?
So I guess I would say two things. One, with respect to questioning the judge, we know this is a judge who has made very small donations to Democratic candidates and campaigns. Expect to hear about that a lot more in the wake of this particular conviction. Now, a New York body overseeing this issue, these ethics issues, said, Judge Merchan, you can go ahead and you can hear this case. Separately, you asked me about the jury instructions, and the one that stands out to me is the idea that, and again, forgive me for the multi-step process, falsification of business records, intent to commit or conceal another crime. The other crime is unlawful election interference. I'm paraphrasing. But what the judge said is when you fill in the meaning of that word unlawful, it could be one of three crimes, and you don't all have to. My understanding is you don't all have to agree on which one, as long as you all agree there was unlawful intent to commit an unlawful activity here. And so that is just not, as I understand it, a typical scheme. It doesn't mean that it's not legal. It means that I think we're going to be hearing more about that as the jury instruction where there might be some question.
Jessica Levinson, tremendously helpful as always. Thank you, Jessica.